Hi, I'm Stephen Johnson. I'm the author of 14 books about the history of science, technology, and innovation. And I'm also the co-creator and editorial director of a new writing and research tool from Google called NotebookLM.
I just happen to be leafing through Where Good Ideas Come From, which is one of my favorite books for the record. Oldie but a goodie. And in that book, you actually advocate walking as a means
Uh,
of, shall we say, courting serendipity. And it just made me think, when all of one's resources are now instantly summonable via NotebookLM, etc., what role does walking play? How do you think about walking in a world with NotebookLM?
when you're walking by yourself, is that it gives you time with your own thoughts and, in a sense, uninterrupted by your reading history or the books or the notes or what you've just written. When you have long stretches of uninterrupted time without any media around you, without any distractions, without listening to a podcast, it gives like each idea time to kind of evolve into something else, right? You start to think about one thing and that brings up another kind of association in your mind, and then that leads to another association, and like often getting to the new insight, you have to have like 6 or 7 jumps of association, to be able to
Totally.
get to something new in your own head.
Totally.
And if you're only thinking in like, 30-second or minute long chunks because you're constantly distracted by something else, you just don't get far enough in those associative trails, right? And so walking is one of the places. It also happens to be like, apparently there is some like physiological thing that happens when people walk at their natural gait. Like the second you walk a little too fast or a little too slow, it gets harder to think. But if you walk at your natural gait, there's something cognitively like rich about that. So that's another element too. I suppose walking at your natural gait while holding Notebook LM in your hand would also
That's
be a
the
productive way to do it.
ultimate,
But
the ultimate. No, but I mean, I think I think one of the things that we all wrestle with, it could be like an existential challenge is in a world where we can increasingly be productive all the time and
yeah,
efficient all the time. How do we, it could even be rationalized, if you will, what Kevin Kelly the other day called uselessness. He said, I try to do something useless every day. And it can feel like walking is useless. And we know it's not, but to me, unless it's actually an explicit goal, it's something I can neglect in the name of productivity. I don't know if you've wrestled with that tension yourself, especially as an expert in innovation, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
yeah. There are two things that brings up to me. The first is the book I wrote, Wonderland, about the history of play. And that was
Another
basically like,
another favorite, by the way, another favorite.
yeah, that of all the kind of innovation books that I've written, that may be my favorite. Actually, I love that book. And part of the argument in Wonderland was like that there was a long history of people pursuing hobbies and interests purely for the kind of playful delight that they got out of them without an objectively useful purpose in the world, without trying to solve a big problem or a small problem. They're just doing something for the fun of it, for the love of it, games and music and, and wandering in the park and all those different things. And, and yet, despite that seeming kind of frivolous nature of the pursuit, those kinds of explorations end up generating like, world changing ideas that are useful because
Are you familiar with Why Greatness Can't Be Planned?
no.
It's a professor in AI called Kenneth Stanley who wrote this book, which I slightly obsess about, and basically makes the same point that we have this fallacy of the objective, and in his view, we should pursue with great intensity interestingness, and by
Yeah.
doing that, you create like basically the stepping stone that creates to greatness. And so his book is about how we get to artificial general intelligence. So it's actually not like a philosophical innovation book at all. But I think both from entrepreneurship and for ideation, it probably is very topical.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because like one of the things that I have loved about Notebook LM, which we can get into in more detail, but um, the kind of core idea that you are able to upload sources that can be your own notes or books that you've read or other documents, PDFs, whatever it is, and then have a conversation with the model about that information. And so it's a kind of a research tool and a kind of thought partner in a sense. And so one of the things that is now possible with these advanced language models like Gemini, which is what underlies NotebookLM, is not just straight kind of search queries. Like that was the way I was originally imagining it when we started to build it. Like, oh, I'll be able to upload all my reading notes from all the books that I read, and I'll be able to say, hey, what was that passage about ant colonies and the way that they, evolve over time, and it would find it for me in a more efficient way. But what it turns out is that these models actually have a concept. They seem to have a understanding, in quotes, of interestingness and of surprise. And so one of the things that I do all the time is like, I'll upload a bunch of new information and I'll be like, okay, what are the most surprising ideas in this about X?
Now,
And
now is it surprising to you? Surprising to know, but like relative to what? Is it
yeah, I don't
relative
know
to what it knows you know?
I think when it answers, so all I can tell you is that it generally does seem to surface, the, the the fact from this source material that if you were then dropped down into a cocktail party and had to like deliver like one fact to somebody like, hey, this is pretty interesting. I think what it is delivering is, let's say you ask for the most surprising fact about ant colony. It knows that it's generally well known that ant colonies have a queen and that ant colonies use pheromones to communicate. And so it's downplaying, even though there's a lot of material in quotes about that, those facts, it chooses not to share that because that's not surprising or interesting. What is interesting is this little known fact that actually is, and so it's just every time I do that, I'm just kind of astonished that like you can interact with the machine with that kind of query. It's pretty cool.
I know for you personally, this is almost like a fanboy moment. It's like this meta moment in a lot of ways. Could we maybe just take a step back? We don't have to go all the way back to kind of hypercard days, but just take a step back, like even to call it May 22. Google team emails you out of the blue and says, we found a way to build this thing. For those who may not be as familiar with your kind of obsession with tools for thought and things like that, what are you thinking in that moment? And why was that cold email so momentous to you as an author?
Yeah, as you said, I've been obsessed with using software to help me augment my thinking and my memory, and my writing process since I was in college, since the late 80s. And I had written a piece for the Times Magazine, like a 10,000 word piece, basically about language models, mostly focused on GPT-3 actually. And because Google's models basically weren't public at that point. But I had gotten access to GPT-3 in the fall of 21. And actually, it's a funny story. Originally, I had pitched to the Times Magazine on a piece about OpenAI's governance structure. I was like, hey, there's this thing where like it's kind of a for-profit, but kind of a nonprofit, and they have
that won't have any relevance to like to current events at any point. Come on.
Exactly. And my idea was like, everybody already knows that GPT-3 is really interesting itself, but nobody knows about this governance structure thing, and I should write a piece about that. And then I got access to GPT-3, and I was like, oh man, it's so much more interesting than I realized. Like, there's so much to say just about that. And so the piece ended up kind of focusing mostly on what it means when computers master language, and it alluded to the governance stuff in the end, and that ended up being a whole other story. But so, and it had occurred to me when I was writing that piece that like, maybe this dream I've always had of the ideal research assistant is now within reach because of these tools. And so, two folks at Google, Clay Bavor and Josh Woodward, had been longtime fans of Where Good Ideas Come From, and were readers of my Substack where I was writing about tools.
It's so cool, right? How these things feed each other.
Yeah.
It's like your ideas about ideas then inspire the builders.
Yeah. And so they had just spun up this new Google Labs division, which there was an older Google Labs, but this is the kind of second coming of it. And a big part of their idea was that like, maybe we could do these co-creations with people who are not necessarily technologists, but are going to be the kinds of people who will use the tools we build. And maybe we could kind of bring them in and have them help us build these products from day one. And so I was kind of the first guinea pig for that approach. And, Clay reached out to me and we had a meeting. Actually, it's very funny. We had a meeting in new kind of 3D Zoom product they have called Project Starline, which is like basically like a hologram of.
Is that a good first impression or bad first
It was
impression?
an unbelievable. It was actually one of the top 5 product demos I've ever seen. I mean, I'm
Oh,
not
wow. Okay.
so I picked
So they wanted to
whatever.
knock your socks off. They're
Yeah.
like, we got to get him way on board.
Well, the hilarious thing was I do this virtual meeting with this hologram of Clay Bavor, who subsequently left, but was running labs at that point. And we have a great meeting. He's like, I think you should just come, like, spend some of your time here and like let's build something together. We've got a little team, we can do it. And I was like, that sounds fantastic. Like, what a cool opportunity. And then I got out of the meeting and I was like, he literally put me in a reality distortion field. Like, not a metaphor.
It's an actual
reality.
physical reality.
But it was great, and it was a very, I don't know, it was a kind of a bold thing. And I honestly, the way I thought about it was, this will be really fun. I doubt we'll actually make anything that sees the light of day, but I'll meet some interesting people, and I'll be right at the center that this, the most important technology of my lifetime, probably. And, I'll get the, explore for a year or something like that. And then we built a little prototype early on. That was basically, it had the core idea. It was from the very beginning. It was like, you upload documents. You're not just having an open-ended chat with the model. You upload documents, and it's what we would now call RAG, but we called it source grounding, which I think is a much better name for it. And
Agreed.
everything that you talk about is grounded in the document that you've shared. So in the early days, it was pretty simple, but we always had that architecture. And it just was one of these things. We built a very quick prototype, and it got a lot of internal attention, all the way up to the very top of the company. And so we kind of got greenlit to do it a little bit more. And then we got an IO last year, which is kind of a big deal, and kind of built up some momentum. But we're still, what's great about it is we're still, even though we just launched in 200 countries and territories around the world just a few weeks ago, supporting a huge number of languages. The team is like, we have like maybe 8 engineers now, like,
Wild.
1 designer, 1 product manager who works with me, Riza Martin, who's amazing. Like, it does feel like a startup, still to this day. And we've been able to build, in part because we're building on top of these models that are so capable. We've been able to build a lot of cool things.
A question that I've been looking forward to ask you is, after kind of starting to do more and more work with NotebookLM and, custom GPTs and stuff like that, I've started to think in repository of content that I need to dump into a NotebookLM, for example. And so, like, the obvious one is everything you've ever written. Like, I noticed in one of the other the podcasts you did with Dan Shipper that you use, I think, Readwise as your way of bookmarking. And so another repository is kind of like anything you ever bookmark in your books. And have you created like a framework, or can you offer advice on like, what are the kind of like the 5 first repository? And I'm asking because I've now started to remind myself to collect stuff. Like, so for example, after we've done this interview, one thing I need to do is to have a transcription of it for creating a repository of all the podcasts we've done.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one way to think about it is, we've never really had a tool like this before. Most of us, I think, have jobs or hobbies that involve synthesizing information across a large number of documents. Like, if you're a researcher or a writer, of course you do. But a lot of people actually have this. Like, the work that they have to do is, it involves information that's scattered across like 10 or 20 or 30 different documents that are floating around. And most of us, I think, live in this kind of world where we have like 10 open tabs of all those documents.
Only 10? I mean,
yeah, right, whatever it is. Like, I mean, right now I have like 40 open, right? But like 10 of those are relevant to the thing that I'm doing right now. And so your work is constantly being like, okay, which tab? I need to find that one quote. Okay, there it is. Okay, now I switch over to that. Now I copy that. Now I paste it back in. And so part of like what we've tried to do with Notebook is to build a tool now. Because of AI, we can build a tool that can just basically like synthesize and help you explore all those documents in one place. So you're just kind of sitting there asking questions, thinking, jotting down ideas, and those documents are just like in the background being drawn upon whenever relevant by the AI to help you do your work. And so you're right, this idea of like collecting these repositories is really important.
You've written about innovation kind of from the outside as a journalist, as a technologist, as a student of the craft. If you look back on how you've described innovation, is there anything that you've learned about from being on the inside that maybe you now see differently, or did it confirm understanding? Did it disconfirm anything? I'd love to know how this experience building has influenced your understanding of innovation.
Yeah, I did have a little bit of insider experience when I was younger because I did a couple of actual startups, Feed, which was the first webzine, and then Outside.in, which was a hyperlocal kind of news service that I launched right after I'd written GhostMap, actually. So it was about kind of mapping information, which is the theme of GhostMap, as you know. But both of those companies, like they got to, 15 or 20 people, and then we sold Outside.in to AOL. So I was always in those cases, I was always, one, I was the CEO, and two, it was an incredibly small team with very small budgets. And I spent a lot of time raising money and all this kind of stuff. And so this is the first time that I've, been inside a large organization. And as my father likes to say, it's the first time I've actually had a real job. It took me to 55 until I.
That's awesome. But finally, gainful employment.
And I think it's been a little bit, it's been, we've had a very unusual situation inside this large company because Labs has a very distinct culture that does align with a lot of the ideas that we're in, where good ideas come from, that there's a lot of emphasis on multidisciplinary collaboration, which is a big theme of that. So
do you mind just telling a little bit more about Labs? There's like a lot of iteration of Google Labs, and it's always super fascinating kind of how you guys build on top of it. Do you mind giving just like 30 seconds on this latest version?
Yeah, I think that it had a couple of different elements to it that, Google has an amazing research division that generates a lot of ideas that inform and enhance what the company ends up producing. But it's also a little bit less kind of like actual product focused research. And then you have the existing mature products that are out there, the workspaces and the search and Android and so on. And so part of the original idea was that kind of Labs is filling a little bit of a hole here, or would be a gap filler of like, what are the things that are possible that don't fit any of the existing product categories as they stand now that we could experiment with? And also the opportunity to build things that are small and can stay small for a while. Like there's a problem when you have multiple product lines that all have more than like 1 billion users, that when you build something that's like, hey, this is pretty cool, and we got 30,000 users, like everybody's like, we don't even know what that number is. What are you talking about? So it was kind of initially, and then it was this idea of co-creation as well and bringing people from the outside. But it ended up very quickly, just because of the timing of it, it ended up really turning into something that's very focused on AI products and figuring out how to innovate on these new AI platforms. The original vision, as it was sketched out in 2021, I think was a little bit less. It had an AI lane, but it had other lanes too. But we ended up, almost all the things we're doing have AI in some kind of component to them now. So it's really cool. Notebook is kind of the consumer facing prototypes and experiments we've come up with. Notebook is the furthest along. We were one of the first. And so we're one of the few ones that have really been released, certainly to an international audience, and that kind of looks like an actual product at this point, rather than just an experiment. So it's an interesting question now, like what's the next phase for NotebookLM, and how do we play with the rest of the Google ecosystem, which I don't know the answer to yet, but because we're the first one kind of along the ladder in that direction.
Is there a portfolio of other kind of experiments that are in the hopper, so to speak? And do you have involvement with other experiments, or are you squarely focused on Notebook?
Yeah, I do. I haven't had an involvement with some of them, which I love, and I wanted to do more. But NotebookLM is just doing it. It's so completely in my wheelhouse that I end up thinking about it more. But if people go to labs.google.com, the portfolio of things that people can try are there. There's some really cool music tools that I'm kind of an amateur musician, and so I love some of the music things that they've been doing.
So maybe let's diving into the tool itself a little bit. Would love to know, Henrik mentioned what are the kind of repositories of information, so to speak. When do you know to call upon Notebook in your own workflow? Like, how do you remember to use it? I've got a Post-it that I keep here on my desk, which is, have you tried ChatGPT? And you have to almost like enter, like all of a sudden we have these alien intelligences available to us. I'd love to know, like, when does it hit your workflow? How do you remind yourself? You as kind of call it the bleeding edge user.
Yeah.
What are your primary use cases and how do you keep it integrated?
Yeah. So let me give you two examples of how I use it. One is I have, it's very meta, but you'll understand why it makes sense. I have a NotebookLM notebook, and that's where I do my thinking for the product itself. So over the life of Notebook, there are a lot of documents that have been created, whether some of them are press releases and some of them are, blog posts, and some of them are how-to documents, and some of them are product feature overviews and things like that. But anyway, in that notebook, the sources that I have added to that notebook are basically all the big documents that have been part of Notebook's history. And then I use that to jot down ideas, so you can just create notes and write notes, just old-fashioned note style. And so I can just say in NotebookLM, I can just type in like, create a taxonomy of all the key terms in the NotebookLM product, and it'll give me an amazing first draft of that. It's a classic kind of work where you're like, I could do it myself. It's not particularly high-level writing, but sitting down and writing a list of all the like key terms and definitions for them it'll take me like 45 minutes. And if Notebook can give me the 95% of it or 90% of it in 35 seconds, like, that's golden.
Totally.
And so that's an example of like, you have a specific project, that project spins out a bunch of documents, you're constantly referring back to information in those documents, and you're also like thinking and jotting down ideas on your own, and you may be creating new documents out of that, the combination of your notes and those sources. That's a great use case for it. The other one that I would mention is kind of early stages of casting about for ideas for my next book, and for the next kind of history book in the Ghost Map mode, or like the Infernal Machine, my latest book that just came out. And when you're in that kind of phase, like, the field is really wide open. Like, you're like, should I write a book about the gold rush? Should I write a book about NASA? Should I write a book about, like puppets? Like, whatever it is. Like, you don't, like, I'm constantly like following different trails or whatever.
There are many authors who can really, select from such a wide array of possibilities. Just
I made up
some people's constraints are a little tighter.
I'm not actually writing a book about puppets, but I do think that yes, that's true. But like there are, I think not all of us, but a lot of people do have things where they're kind of have ruminations. Like, I'm thinking about startup ideas, or I'm thinking about, this. And so I created a new notebook called The Next Book. And that was a place where I would just go, and whenever I, had an idea, I would jot down a note in the notebook. But more than that, I would be like, okay, I'm thinking about the gold rush. So I'm going to go read a great book from like 30 years ago about the gold rush and get some quotes from that. And then I'm using Readwise, which gathers quotes from your Kindle. I can bring those quotes into Notebook, and then that's there. And then I was thinking about NASA. And so I had these oral histories of the Apollo program. And so I brought those into that notebook. And so I'm slowly accumulating a bunch of different sources related to all the various different things. It's a very disorganized notebook because it's like NASA and Gold Rush and various other things in there. But that's a place where I could then at any moment sit down and be like, okay, what was I thinking about a couple of weeks ago? What was that idea? And the last thing I'll say about it is that I've actually started now, and this has really only become possible with the latest version of Gemini. I've actually started doing things like, hey, here's a bunch of readings that I just have collected on this particular topic. And I'll write effectively a query or a prompt that's like, I'm Stephen Johnson, author of books like The Ghost Map that are multi-threaded, multidisciplinary, like narrative histories. I'm thinking about writing a book about the gold rush. Here's a bunch of quotes from a couple of books that I've just read. What do you see that's interesting in here, given who I am and given what I'm trying to write? And it's actually quite good at picking out bits that might be useful, or suggesting framings that might be useful.
Can you
I'm
talk about
still,
that conversation? Because I
yeah,
know it's not just like it's not a one shot, zero shot. Hey, what's interesting? Great. Thanks, NotebookLM, for another book idea, right?
yeah.
Talk about the dialogue. How are you pushing back? How are you digging deeper, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so you'll get that it's so amazing actually, because you'll get it'll say, so in the gold rush example, it'll come back and say, well, there seems to be a lot of material here about the clash between the influx of new settlers chasing gold and the existing Native American populations in this region. And it'll kind of summarize that, and along with a couple of other themes that you could explore.
You've already uploaded your sources. Is there a world in which it actually recommends to you other sources that you don't know of?
Yeah, there will be a world like that, Jeremy.
In the not too distant future, yes.
How about
I'll say, like, the meeting that I'm going to as soon as we get off this call is directly related to that. Like,
It
kind of
seems
exploration.
like a natural evolution, right? It's like have you read this work? Have you seen
Yeah,
this paper? It's one thing to query the stuff that you already know of, which
yeah,
is an incredible feat. I can hardly remember the things I supposedly know. But
yeah,
then to go a step farther and say, if this was of interest, the book you really should read?
yeah. If only I knew a company that was really good at finding information that gathered all around the world.
Feels like there's a
we,
big white space in the market, something like that. Yeah.
How about the tone of voice? A lot of time people complain about, like AI writing a little bit bland. Obviously, somebody of your caliber of authorship is probably very sensitive to the tone. Have you found like a good way of making it write a different way, or prompting it to do something different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's two things about tone, actually. Like, one of the things that's interesting, it's been our kind of ethos in general, and I think this is true still in the product. So I did a style guide actually for Notebook LM, like as if you were a magazine editor, like this is what the model should sound like. And we've kind of used that as a kind of like Bible for like the voice of the model from the beginning. And one of the
For
things
your,
that
by the way, for your version or for everyone's version?
just
Like just
no, for everyone's version, like
okay.
the kind of what's the default setting. And one of the things that was in the kind of system level prompt for it is like, don't refer to yourself in the first person. So it doesn't try to be an entity. It doesn't try to be your friend. It's kind of just like, here's the information you want. It will occasionally say like, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. But generally it should not actually ever refer to itself as an I, which is like, I don't know. I may be like out of the mainstream on this, but to me, it's like, I don't want you to pretend to be a person. I just want you to give me the information that I want in the most efficient way possible. But in terms of the voice, I did some very early experiments when I got to Google with style. I tried to create. I gave it an earlier. This is back in the Palm days, but I gave it a bunch of like Orwell, and I was like, okay, write like Orwell, and would translate this passage into Orwell language, and translate this passage into like Dickens language, and it was pretty good at it. And the thing we've always talked about is like, could we somehow actually train a model on my voice and get it to what would it look like if it wrote in my style. We no, we haven't done that yet, but that's something we talk about. And I can
How
imagine
would
the
you
future.
feel about that? A lot of people, I would imagine, are like, I don't want to put my content on like the notebook because, I'm sure Google is then going to write the book that I have always been wanted to write, which
Yeah.
obviously not true. But like, do you have any concern as an author of like uploading your books and having the model have access to it and all those different things?
Well, one of the things that's really important about the way that we designed Notebook LM from the very beginning, we've been very kind of rigorous about this, is we don't we do not train the model on anything that anybody uploads. So what we're doing is simply, when you upload sources, we are taking information from those sources or the entirety of the sources and putting it in the context window of the model, the short-term memory of the model. and we're saying answer this question or, come up with this summary based on this information. The second that query is over, that information gets wiped, and there's no like long-term training or long-term storage of that information. So, which is important from a writer's point of view, from a privacy point of view, also important from a copyright point of view. So if you have the rights to, assemble quotations from a book that you've paid for as a reader, you have the ability to use those inside of NotebookLM without worrying that some bit of copywritten information would be used to train the model in the future. So I feel secure about that. The trickier thing is kind of what you're also kind of alluding to is like, how does one feel about like, if I were to actually train a model on my writing style, is it creepy? Is it alarming? Would it be if it really does start to sound like me? And if, is there a world in a year or two where one of these models trained on my voice, given a kind of topic and some sources, could plausibly write a chapter that might pass the Turing test of like Stephen's writing? That is imaginable. Would I use that to write a book? No. Would I use it to like maybe help suggest alternate phrasings or things like that?
Yeah,
Your
no wasn't conclusive, by the way. Your
Yeah.
no had a question mark, just for the record. If we're looking
Yeah.
at Henrik's transcript, your no
Yeah.
was like I don't think so, but
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
Is there, am I reading between the lines there, or how do you
The way
really?
I think about it is like for me, I think what's going to happen is as tools like, NotebookLM become more common, and as folks who write for a living embrace what they do, the initial phase is going to be, it just lets you do the thing you already do much faster, and more efficiently and to stay in a kind of flow state. And instead of going through all the different tabs, instead of searching, through all your old PDFs, you can just ask a question and get it, and you can just write, more effectively. And so it's going to be like a huge win, I think, for a stretch of time. Maybe it's like 3 or 4 or 5 years. Then there's a point where one has to raise the question of like, does writing become more like conducting than actually writing? And you're like,
Totally.
Okay, NotebookLM version 5.0. I have an idea for a book about the gold rush. Suggest, a structure for it. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Change this. Okay. All right, I like this opening chapter idea. Suggest an outline for that opening chapter. Okay, that's good. I like that. Let's change this. Now let's work on that first paragraph. Give me a first draft in my voice, please. Yeah, that's pretty good, but that first sentence is wrong. Let me just rewrite that by hand. Like,
it seems hard to believe that it won't go that way, right?
Yeah. And I think, I don't know.
And would that be the benefits is easy, but I wonder, like in a way that, we invented Instagram, I'm sure that nobody thought that would kind of lead to the demise of mental health for kids, right? It was just like, it was very difficult to fathom that kind of link. If we were thinking about those like 3 or 4 years out, and we are no longer chit-chatting over a meeting because most of us are just brainstorming with our NotebookLM, and we're doing all these different things. Like, what do you think is some of those kind of like not necessarily thought through consequences of this? Or maybe what do you worry about?
Yeah, I think one obvious one is using these tools, not necessarily, Notebook wouldn't be particularly well suited for this, but other related tools to just create kind of junk content. There's already been this kind of concern about the web just getting overrun with kind of middling, kind of vaguely interesting, but also formulaic AI writing that is just
like, it's like novel spam, right? It's book spam. Yeah.
And I think that I think that there's probably some version of the future where we do need to kind of authenticate human participation in just as we're talking about, watermarking images to show that they've been generated with AI, a lot of interesting investigations in that front, and that there may be some kind of point of like, hey, this novel was in fact written by a human, and I only want to search for things written by humans.
Is that a slightly potentially anachronistic view? I mean, it's interesting to consider that our default assumption is that a human being involved produces a better work.
Yeah.
Is there, if the goal, like Guy Kawasaki said something to us that I've really been thinking about ever since our conversation, which is my agreement with the reader isn't that I write every line, but that I produce the best possible book
Yep.
for their consumption.
I mean, well, look, first off, there's so many questions, and that's why it's such an incredibly interesting inflection point to be thinking about these things. I feel confident that the best books, just to think about books, the best books will, whether they are written just with a kind of like virtual research assistant like NotebookLM is in its current form, or whether they're maybe written in a kind of conductor mode where there's a real partnership between the human and the AI, and perhaps some future where the AI is the leader in the exchange. The best books produced will get better and better thanks to these tools. So that's good news. Then there's a question of like, what happens?
But
below it?
just get provocative question is book themselves. I mean, like if I just look at some of my behavior now, I buy a book, I then put it into Notebook, and then I basically are in conversation with Stephen Johnson about something. And then obviously the format is then tailored to where I, in my mind, and the narrative kind of get crafted around my journey, which seems to be a more modern potential way of doing it, where the book format, of course, is something that was fit a specific format because you had to print it, and that was therefore how you created that format.
Yeah, that was exactly the next thing I was going to say, which is that not only will like the underlying text in traditional book form at the high end get better and better thanks to these tools, but new forms of reading will become possible. And already right now, as you say, like if you load a book into, like I have Where Good Ideas Come From in a notebook, and it's so cool to, in a sense, read it by, particularly if you've already read it from the beginning. So you've read it once straight back to, front, or you've written it, so you know it really well. But then you read it by following the suggested questions we get. So whenever you're in dialogue, we're always suggesting like a follow-up question or two based on what you've just said and based on the book. And the answers are now so nuanced, and Notebook writes these like 4 or 5 paragraph little mini essay answers, and the questions that it suggests are very deep. And so again, we started this conversation with talking about like associative trails in your mind when you're walking, right? And the reason why that's powerful is that you are able to follow a trail of associations, and that gets you to a new insight that you might not have otherwise gotten to. Notebook does that as well. If you read instead of kind of in a linear way, you read it by following trails of questions. And that, when I first saw that feature live in the product and I did it with my own book, like I was like, this is such an incredible way to explore knowledge.
Describe that. Somebody say they log into NotebookLM. How would they follow a trail of questions? Just like very basic, practically.
Yeah. Okay. So imagine you could upload any document, but if you happen to have a PDF of a book of some form that you have access to, let's say you upload that. Almost immediately, Notebook will generate what's called a notebook guide, which will give you a summary, and it will suggest like 3 high-level questions for understanding the material. But you could start with your own question, and whatever you're interested in, you could just type in and say, tell me more about ant colonies in this book, whatever it is. At that point, you'll get an answer, and then on the screen right above the chat box, you will see 3 little questions that are like based on what you've just asked and the material in the book. I had this bias coming into the product because I'm trained as a writer and a journalist. Like I know how to ask good questions of material or of people I'm interviewing. But that's not a skill that, everybody has. And people often sat down in Notebook and they're like, I don't know what to ask. And so we were like, oh, let's suggest question. And then once we did that, we realized that was a whole other way of exploring the material that was really interesting. And so to get back to like the original thing you were saying, Hedrick, it creates new kinds of books. It's almost like the dream of the hypertext book that was animating me when I was in the late 80s, even before the web, where people are going to write new kinds of books with links that you can follow and go in different directions.
Go to page 264 for yes.
Yeah.
adventure. Yeah.
idea books. And it never really happened, like it happened only really in the form of Wikipedia. But other than that, like people generally kind of read in a linear way still, and they read the web and follow links. But then once they get to the article, they're pretty much reading start to finish. But now you have this like conversational way of exploring a large body of information. And that is really new and was never possible before. And so I think the combination of like maybe better books and new conversational ways of exploring those books is going to be something I feel really it's harder to see the downside.
Last question from me is, what are pitfalls you would recommend people avoid and how? So somebody comes to NotebookLM for the first time, what's dumb stuff or areas where people get stuck, underperforming capabilities, missed opportunities? What should people avoid doing? Don't be.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing that our biggest problem, I think, is that you can't do anything without sources. So it's still excellent at answering questions, but sometimes you used to be able to say like, hey, write a sonnet based on these non-poetic sources,
Right,
and it would
right.
do a great job. But sometimes now it says, well, sonnets are not mentioned in these sources, so I can't do that. And I'm actually, one of the things I'm working on right now is trying to figure out like what happened.
You just refresh the page. I find sometimes just refreshing, it's like I get a new chat bot, right?
Yeah, no, something changed, and I still haven't specified what that is. It's not a calculator. It will retrieve numerical facts from your documents quite accurately, but you don't want to ask it to perform like statistical analyses of things. It just, their language models, not number models yet. So that's one you want to watch out for. But the one thing to embrace now that's just amazing is how multilingual it is. So we're seeing this huge spike of usage in Japan. And one of the things that people are doing is there's a lot of English documents that Japanese people have to deal with, but like English is not as common a language in Japan. And so people are able to upload an English document and have an entire conversation with the model about the document in Japanese. And that's just kind of crazy that you can do that now. So anything, I mean, I even have, and the image stuff that we have now too. So Walter Isaacson has been using it for his new biography that he's doing on Marie Curie and her husband. And I have, as a sample of this handwritten note that Marie Curie wrote in like 1902 in French, like a scan of it, scrawled French, like with a bunch of like chemistry, like symbols and stuff like that. And I put that image on a slide and brought it into NotebookLM. And I was like, okay, translate this and explain what you think its significance is. And it's just a bunch of pixels, right? It's just like pixels showing like, scrawled handwriting from 120 years ago in French. And it's like, oh, this appears to be a document. It looks like it might be written by Marie Curie. Here's what it says.
This is the shopping list, tomatoes, that we keep.
Yeah. It was kind of disappointing what it turned out to be. But the fact that, you could do that kind of stuff with images now, or you could put a chart in there and it will understand it, even if it's just pixels, even if, there's no like OCR on the chart or text associated with the chart. That stuff is really cool. I only talked about the limitations for like 3 seconds, and I started talking about the good things. I'm sorry. I was just too excited about the project.
You're a proud papo. Nobody can blame you.
Well, people should definitely go and check it out. And I think we're about to reach the end of like the time we have, but anything else that you want to add? All the things we forgot to ask you about?
Yeah, we covered it all. We just love to get feedback from people, and please do try it. And as I said, we do have a Discord where people are welcome to come and post their, like, we just love to hear use cases if people come up with it. It's a very like flexible platform. Like you can push it in all sorts of like directions that like aren't in our heads yet.
That's awesome. And we look forward to reading the book about the puppets of ants going to space,
like connecting the dots.
All innovation is just recombination, right?
It sells itself. I mean, it really sells itself.
Just rolls off the tongue so easily. Incredible. Right on.
Super fun, guys.
All right, be good.
Jeremy, tell me your reflections.
I thought I was expecting to get insights into the future of authorship. I thought it was really cool thinking about the future of readership. That was particularly cool. And then, of course, my mind can't help but go to all sorts of unexpected use cases well beyond, call it writing and research, which I think are just, weeks away, if not days away, for organizations to think about leveraging to create their own, call it organizational notebooks. To my mind's just spinning far beyond kind of the ability to write and read. This tool really has the potential to be revolutionary. And so super cool to hear about his journey. Super cool. I mean, having been a fan of his for a long time and seen his obsession with tools for thought and things like that, to see it actually come to fruition is really fun and neat. And then just to be sparked into what are all the possible use cases far beyond even his imagination. I think it was super fun discussion. What about you? What struck you?
I think I'll plus one to everything you said. I mean, like this idea of what is the future of books is fascinating. Like, will we just have long conversations with kind of like the synthetic version of Stephen on like a new topic, and then what would that look like? I think that to be incredibly fascinating. Having been somebody who's been in the incubation space for a long time, obviously quite fascinated about this idea of a new Google Apps and kind of like a new way of trying it. And I think it's fascinating, this kind of core concept of bringing external people in to be the domain experts, have the customer founder fit, if you like, and then merge them with obviously the brain power of all the Googlers. I'm excited to see what's going to come out of that.
Yeah, I thought, yeah, just to your point on kind of the model for innovation, super interesting to think about Google bringing him in as, call it, a lead user and then employing him, right? Because now he's a full-time employee. And that to me is pretty fascinating. I think in most of the innovation efforts I've seen, there is an attempt at, call it a separation, so to speak, of we're designing for this person who's outside us, who's other than us. And there's a lot of, I would say, even kind of deprecation of models like co-creation. And so for Google to go from co-creation to actually employing the customer in a way, or employing the user, it's just I haven't actually processed it all, but now that you mention it, it's a pretty radical departure in terms of innovation model. What do you think? What's your, if you had to make a prediction for the future about this model of innovation, anything that sparks for you as an innovation expert yourself?
Well, most of these lab incubators, like have a tough time, right? Because anything that's not a billion users is kind of like a miss. And so I think what's cool about both him as a person and I think this approach is that it seemed to be much more driven by curiosity without necessarily kind of a goal of making a billion user product. And I do think back to his point about playing, that is probably the best way you get to these disproportionately big outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, and you always want to hire the person who doesn't need a job, right? And so hire the customer that doesn't need a job is probably a pretty great guideline there as well, right? But
Awesome.
they're willing to follow their curiosity and their interestingness to great places. Super cool.
I think we're off for this time.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us on this adventure. If you enjoyed this conversation with Steven Johnson, please smash that like button, smash that share button, recommend it to a budding author or reader or researcher in your life who may have strong opinions about the future of authorship, readership, and technology.
You, my friend.
Adios.